It for now, but I already shared it with my other students in case they're not here or they're in my other group and they can't make it so early in the morning. Students don't like early mornings. It's only 9:30 for you, so it's better and more reasonable than last time we had you online. But thanks for coming for sure, Ken. And why don't you introduce yourself and let the students know what you work on?
Sure. My name is Ken Lane. I'm API Evangelist. I am a old database guy, so I've been doing databases for 30 years, since the 1980s. And since the internet comes out, I've been developing software that runs on the internet, distributed software. And for the last 7 years, since 2010, I've been studying APIs or web APIs and how people are building software, good or bad, using web APIs. And so pretty much everything we have these days has an API dependency somewhere. So if we're paying with our credit card, if we're on a surveillance camera, if we're using Facebook, Twitter, or mobile phones, everything has APIs these days. And that's what I pay attention to. But I don't just pay attention to the technical, I pay attention to the business of it, how money is made, how our data is sold, and I pay attention to the politics of it. So how you agree to terms of service when you use APIs, when you use Twitter's API or Facebook's, and all the way up to how do you ruin a U.S. democracy using APIs and electing a certain president in our country. So there's lots of things going on right now that are API driven, lots of automation, and that's what I do.
Cool. Let me just do a check. I'm not blowing out your ears with the feedback or anything. Am I, Ken? Is the sound okay?
No, actually it sounds really nice.
Awesome. Good. I just want to make sure, because I've had that happen to me and it freaks me out when I'm trying to do talks over webcam.
Yeah, I'm actually deaf in my left ear, so I only have a little bit of hearing. So if it's bad, I know it.
All right, cool. Pablo had a question. You posted. I posted that to Ken earlier, so I'll let you kind of ask it again. This is Pablo over here.
Yes, well, my question was about how do you handle a persistent session? In my projects, I use the JSON Web Token node package. And what I've been doing is that on my database tables, each account has an ID, and the other tables, well, they have a column, which is the owner ID that points to the ID of the account table. And when a user authenticates, I send them a JSON Web Token that in the payload, it has the account ID. And in further requests, they send it each time. I decode it and return them a select or something from a database table with a word clause that the owner ID is the account ID that was sent in the JSON Web Token. But as I've said, I'm merely a user. I guess I haven't done my due diligence and I just require the package and use it. So I wanted to know what are your thoughts on JSON Web Token and more broadly, how should we be handling this kind of stuff so that a user cannot trigger an endpoint that will retrieve data from another user or maybe delete it or something like that?
And I'll interject as well, Ken. Pablo was talking to me in his office. He's doing some work with drones, with a drone company. And I know Ken's been doing some playing around with drones and
exciting. With drones. Yeah, drones are an interesting API. Lots of API fun there. We won't get started there. But as far as, session management, I mean, that's, JSON Web Token is a good start. The tokenization part of that conversation. JSON Web Token, even though it is a standard, it is a fairly new standard. So along with any new standard, you're going to be making sure that it's going to be going through a period where everyone's trying to hack it and make sure it's stable and make sure it's mature. And that's a trade-off you have to make when you adopt any new standard. I mean, OAuth still has its issues and it's a couple years older, but JSON Web Token is a good solution, but it should be just, in my mind, the front line of your session identification. And this, you should be, with APIs, one of the things that come with API management is the awareness that comes from logging, calls and being able to add on dimensions to what you consider, session management or session state. And how do you use, IP address? How to use timestamps? How to use, other identifying information that build a more complete profile of that session. And then more importantly, how do you react to that in the logging layer or the API management layer, based upon, the token is a good place to start. But if you are looking at just purely token, like you said, you're going to quickly see that tokens get reused. People are using tokens that should not be using them. And so you're going to have to be looking at, IP address, timestamp, other user agent, other identifying, client aspects that identify who that person is and look for inconsistencies and patterns. And this is very much, you'll see a lot of machine learning companies popping up right now to analyze that layer for you. So there's no really easy answers here, but there's a lot of machine learning that will help you. You can point to TensorFlow to your log files and start identifying these patterns and then responding to those. And how quickly you can respond is really, so how much access does a illegal usage of a token or unauthorized usage of a token get before you notice it and before you respond and shut that down. That's how I would handle that. So there is no perfect answer to session state. You should have multiple dimensions, and you should be aware of how those dimensions are being used and act upon them. Now, I would say also, this is where surveillance comes in. This is where APIs and surveillance begins. So there's two sides to this coin. You're trying to understand as many dimensions about that session as you possibly can to verify that is, yes, that is a token. Yes, that is an IP address that would make sense associated with the token. This is a usage patterns. When I say timestamp, I just don't mean one timestamp. I mean consecutive timestamps in the log. This is standard session behavior for this token. This is how they should be accessing it and how they're using it in relation to other healthy patterns. And that's also where you start surveilling your customers and surveilling your users. So how many dimensions you add in there and how much, how actively you pay attention to this, you have to ask yourself, at what point are you is it becoming surveillance and you're thinking too hard about security? And then you have to ask yourself, is this resource that I'm making available, what level of security is warranted or suitable for this? And there are no perfect answers. You just have to come up with a balance for session, that makes sense. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
It's interesting because you bring up the point, Ken, that it's always this balance between security and privacy. And you're touching on that a little bit in terms of the log files and how much should we be keeping in the log files and how we should be keeping those is always interesting as well.
Yeah, lots of questions. Just along with trying to understand your user and what their intentions are, you should also be asking that of yourself on a regular basis. What are my intentions here? And the more data you store to paint that picture of session state in a stateless environment, you have at some point you have to question your own motivations, or at least how that could be abused. Yes, you're collecting all this data. Yes, you have a very robust view of session across your users. You're able to secure your resources. You have robust amounts of logging data from many different angles. what happens when you have a breach, and someone is able to get at that data, and you have to, ask yourself, is that worth it?
Right. Yeah. Who else has thoughts? I've always got stuff I can throw, but I want you guys to ask questions. This is Francisco here at the front.
Hey, so what can you do to make an app more secure? Is there like a pipeline or a procedure?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I like your beard, sir. Very nice.
I knew you would.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is no perfect security, but it always starts with encryption. Everything should be encrypted in transport and in storage, if possible. And so, thinking about your encryption strategy is always the front line. Having a some sort of tokenization, JWT is a good start. If there's a 3 legs in that, meaning you have the user authenticating, you should be thinking about OAuth, but that, the tokens are more, I would say, identification than they are ever security. I mean, they are security, but they are knowing. It's more about the session awareness and knowing who's connecting and who's accessing, and having that identifier in the logs. So that tokenization is and access and authentication is the second tier kind of security. Logging, so that all activity is logged, and not just having a single API management layer, but also having your web server logs, your database logs, your DNS logs, as well as your API logs, all in sync. So you think about the DNS is the front line of it. Your API management layer and kind of token authentication is the second tier. Then your web service, then maybe your database backend, and any other kind of backend services that you may have running. And then if all of those are in one unified logging system that you're able to watch in real time or near real time, that's that awareness is really, I think, where security comes into play, because with APIs, the goal is we're always trying to strike that balance. We're not trying to secure these resources 100%. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be putting them online. We probably wouldn't be using the web to share them with partners, make them available to customers and third-party developers. So if we wanted them secure, we would put them in a safe on a USB drive, and nobody would touch them. But so it's about finding this balance of securing them and letting people have access to them. And so a big part of that, you can encrypt, you can tokenize, you can shut off, you can rate limit access. I think having an API management layer where you can rate limit who has access to what. So you're my best friend, you get great access. You're my ex business partner, you get less access, but you still are entitled. So how do you rate limit and maintain security, but through all of that logging and that awareness layer, and being able to react to that? I mean, most of the biggest breaches you hear about, the Equifax one that recently, it was API related. It was a Java struts patch that they didn't apply, but the Java struts had a REST plugin on top of it, and they didn't have any sort of API management, solid API management and awareness on it. So people are just, able to get in. That's the one part of the security. The fact that they're able to pull out, 230 million records, your API management and logging should identify that. And then I would add also a testing and monitoring layer is you should be testing your own API calls. You should be looking to make sure that the JSON schema or XML schema is appropriate, that there's nothing injected in there. So when your API management layer, yes, I'm looking for right token. Someone has access to this. Someone's making the right call, but is every call or response well formed and have what it should have in it. If not, after 10, 20, 30 records going out the door, I should know that someone's moving a lot of data from a single key that's an irregular pattern, and that the JSON coming through it is not correct. So there's just many layers of security breaches there. There's, you know, the patching your backend system. There's having an API management layer and awareness and being able to respond to it. There's testing and making sure, you know, what is coming in and out, you know, the response and request is proper. And there's just a whole bunch of bad mistakes there in that Equifax breach.
Yeah, they don't have any monitoring.
Yeah, we talked about that quite a bit. Yeah. Other thoughts? Come on, Eric, Candy, Nate, Santiago, Christian. No? Go ahead, Eric.
I got one not so related to right now, but I was reading one of your latest posts, and it was about unsolved problems in the APIs. And as I was reading, it made me sound, well, I was thinking that what you were saying is that pretty much APIs are pretty much a freemium, kind of a freemium usage, as in you pay us to do something, or more like you have the access to do something, or you have the power to do something, but later on, if you want to solve problems, you have to pay more. And well, there was this point where that you wrote that there are so many unsolved problems, and the creators of the APIs or the business, they realize that these problems are there, but they don't want to solve them, or they're unsolved, so they can merchandise them later. Do you think these problems, most of these problems, are unsolved in a contained environment, as in that they are not a threat to anyone using this API or the company itself or the producer itself? Do you think these are contained, or do you think these are just, oh, this will never happen, let it be unsolved?
Yeah, you know, what you build an API for, I mean, there's plenty of APIs and not all of them are good. Very few of them are good. I would say, you know, you have to be very aware when an API is out there. It may seem very valuable to you as a developer, but you have to, you know, this is why I say the technology, the business, and the politics of APIs. The technology may interest you as a developer, but if you're not thinking about why are they doing this, what's their business model, what is the problem that they're solving, and what's the future of that look like, you might, you know, you might be setting yourself up for some. It's really common to do free work. You know, many Silicon Valley startups are looking to just get you to work for free for them. One of the new versions of this you'll see is machine learning training. You'll see a lot of opportunities, companies trying to get you to help train their machine learning algorithm by connecting your data, playing some game, doing something for free in you know, maybe for some sort of small reward, but they're just trying to get access to your data to train their algorithms that they're going to make money on down the road. And so you'll see in 9 months they'll shift and they'll pivot and they'll be doing something entirely different than what they told you they were going to do. And so most of the problems that are put out there, you know, or APIs being solutions for, aren't really the problem that's really trying to be solved. A lot of times it's part of a larger investment portfolio. So it's meant to do something that you know, try to think of a good example, but you know, the machine learning is a good one, but it's meant to just get the fact that you're using it so that they can go sell to someone else and say, I have, you know, 300 developers using my machine learning API. They're just using you to go get something else with their investors. And so I would say, you know, 70% of the time you see an API out there, the reason it's put there and the description of it is not what it's for. They're phishing. It's kind of like email phishing in your email to get you to do something, but it's a much slower moving way of getting you to use their service for free and maybe connect it to your business system or build an interesting application. But really, it's just about getting that API connected into you and what you're doing, get your data and suck it out, and then be able to say, hey, I have someone doing something interesting. It has very little to do with you. I don't know. Maybe that answers your question. I'm not sure. Sorry.
Well, my question was more of the unsolved problems that are left. The unsolved problems that are left behind on purpose. Are they? Do you think these unsolved problems are left behind as in, oh no, that would never happen in the API, just leave it unsolved, or they are controlling the environment of, if this problem happens, well, we've got it secure. The user has to pay more if they want to solve this problem, really.
Yeah, well, there's a couple things there. So one, some problems are left behind because they're real problems and they're really difficult and there's no money to be made. So fixing the water problem in Flint, Michigan, there's not a lot of money in fixing lead in the water and building an application or a set of sensors that will tell you when people are being poisoned by their water. There's not a lot of money to be made in there. There may be money, but it's not shareholder profit money. And then the other part of this is who's building the technology. I mean, you have to look in the US and in Silicon Valley very much so. There's a certain class of people who are identifying the problems and deciding which problems get fixed or which ones are real. And most of them they're not going to see as problems because it's not a problem in their life. They live we live a pretty privileged life in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and so the problems they face, if it's not something they understand and see. I mean, I think the recent one this last week was the Bodega. I don't know if you saw the story of that startup called Bodega that was looking to do away with the corner market. And I'm in New York City right now, so I just moved to New York City, and I love my corner store. I love going down there and talking to the people, and so that's a really good example of how technologists, they see that as a problem. They don't see it as a solution, because they go to the corner store and they don't feel comfortable. They don't have a conversation with the person there. They just wanted the razors and the pack of gum. Why can't I get that out of a machine? I shouldn't have to deal with all of this rest of this. And so they saw that as a problem, where the rest of us see that as an amazing, part of our life and our community. It's not a problem. So what they see as problems. And then I would say the third dimension is really, yes, that's a problem. But in startup, you see this a lot in startup camps where they'll say, learn something about a business sector, learn enough to identify the problems and people's pain points, and then watch it for 18 months. Don't address the problem. And then come in and provide a solution, and then take that solution away after another 6 months, and then see what people will pay for this to have the solution back. So yes, sometimes maybe it's a problem and they have the solution for it, but they're waiting for the right set of market forces to be able to reintroduce their solution so that they can make the maximum amount of money. Did that get closer?
Yes, it did. So it pretty much depends.
It's difficult. These are difficult problems. So I got another one for you, Ken. And yes, I love visiting my corner store too. It's definitely not a problem. So this is from Isaac. He's a little shy, so I'll ask for him. I want to ask about third-party APIs that are created when the company doesn't create an official API themselves. This is in the gamer area more as well. This was the case of a massive bots and spoofers in Pokemon Go. Should companies create an official API? Thoughts on that? Riot Games did this in order to reduce their server load because people were getting around the fact that there was no API, but then it's just loading down the servers and making more. work for them. So what about companies being proactive creating APIs? I'll interject too. There was a story recently about the U.S. Postal Service and the fact that they should be more proactive in harnessing APIs actually to create revenue, which would help them survive.
Yeah, that's yes. If a company has a website, a mobile app, a desktop app, or environment, a game that runs in a console environment, they should have APIs. They're using APIs. Problem is they just don't have those well-defined and thinking about the wider usage of those API resources. And the best example, I call these rogue APIs. So the best example of a rogue API out there that changed a company's behavior is for Instagram. The first Instagram API was a rogue API. And so when Instagram started, they were just a mobile app. They didn't have a website. They had an API, and someone reverse engineered the mobile app and published an API. And they had asked Kevin, Kevin Systrom, who's the founder of Instagram, if he was going to do a website or an API. And he said, no, I'm just interested in the mobile app. And so they launched the Rogue API, and it became wildly popular. People built a lot of things on it. And then I think that was in December, I forget which year, but by January, February, Kevin said, hey, could you take your API down? We're going to launch our own in response and start understanding this. And this is very common. I mean, if you look at Snapchat, if you look at WhatsApp, if you look at many of these popular mobile apps, people who have reverse engineered their API from their mobile app, and there's SDKs out there that you can use to connect. If you've has anybody ever used Charles Proxy, or there's a couple others out there, but Charles Proxy is a good one for routing your iPhone or your Mac, traffic to your Mac, and it'll record all API calls being made, and you can map that out. Now, some of those smarter apps, you have to deal with certificate issues. They use like SSL pinning to make sure that your client is using the same certificate as the server wants. But there's ways around that too. You can find pretty good examples of someone who just reverse engineered Starbucks apps and how to do it. So it's not like you can't do it. So companies should have APIs, and they should have public API programs. Even if they don't let everybody build something on that, they should. And I see that I'm seeing this more of this pressure play out in the gaming world, where gaming companies are starting to have API programs. The reason they don't is because a lot of these companies just are not used to thinking outside of their silo and thinking about the wider public usage of their game, the resources that are available in that, and they don't really want to open that up and have that conversation. They're not equipped to have that conversation, but they need to. If you're doing business using HTTP, whether it's secure, whether it's encrypted, you should be ready to have a conversation with how people are going to use your resources. And you should be developing that awareness that I talked about in the API management layer. You should open up a little bit more, because people are going to use your resources in ways you didn't intend. And you should be ready to have that conversation and just talk about what that looks like, what security looks like, how you say no to people and why you say no. If you tell a really crafty developer who's found an interesting way of doing things, if you told them no, let the rest of your community know why you're saying no to that, and be honest about it. The problem is most companies don't want to be honest about that. They just, they're being greedy. They're being a lot of times incompetent. A lot of times on the back end, they don't know how to secure these things, and they don't know how to have the conversation about partner usage. So they just sue. And I would say, was it Niantic who's behind Pokemon? I don't think they're very very equipped to play nicely. You know, they want it all for themselves, and they don't understand the potential of opening up.
Right, and a lot of gaming companies like Blizzard or CCP Games with EVE Online, they've harnessed the community to do tons of the work that they don't have to do themselves by opening it up. So it's a really good thing. And surprise, the API Evangelist says people should make APIs. Awesome. The world is good. So Nay's got a question in the back. I'll hold up the microphone. So
How was it working with the government, and what red flags did you see while working there?
Oh God. Yeah. I'm not very good at working with the government because I like to tell stories out publicly, and I couldn't blog when I worked for the government, so that sucked, and I didn't like that. But I love the work, and I still keep doing the work. I just can't legally be responsible for myself when I work for the government. So it's very rewarding. You know, I work on APIs from working with like our military and our veterans to build APIs that help students file for their financial aid and get their loans and grants for school, to how do you find the national parks, you know, how do you visit the Grand Canyon and rent a campsite, all the way to FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. So how do you submit through an API, how you get government documents that should be open, because you can get at, you know, I can FOIA Trump's emails and messages, you know, through an API. So the work is very rewarding. What concerns me is I would go and listen to Obama. So I worked in 2013. I was in DC yesterday or the day before, but I don't work in government agencies anymore. But I would listen to Obama, and at the time his CTO would talk about the opportunity of this thing right here, and said this is the greatest opportunity we've had to serve the citizens of America, serve our country, and help people, you know, get services, get their student loans, help, you know, pay their taxes, help get health benefits. This is the best opportunity we have to understand what our citizens want. And then I would go across town to the and listen to, at the time, General Keith Alexander talk, who was the director of the NSA. And he gave a speech. This was all in 1 week. This is the greatest opportunity we have to understand what our citizens are doing and how we can watch them and understand what they're doing, and how we can take action against people who want to do us harm. We've never had an opportunity like this to know what is going on. This is a great time to live. Mm-hmm. And so I see that as a red flag. That people, and then when you go to, you can go to Silicon Valley and listen to Mark Zuckerberg talk. This is the greatest opportunity we have to understand what people in America are doing. And so that people can use the same language and see technology in the same ways, but have very different motivations, is very, very scary. And I was part of a wave of people coming from Silicon Valley into the federal government, from Google, from startups, and people are very happy to put technology to use, but without thinking about the consequences and thinking about how that technology can be used for bad purposes. And I just learned a lot about how what I build can be used for bad. And it's something that will stick with me forever.
And I think that's an excellent question, Nate. And a lot of these kids are probably thinking about, well, most of them are actually working already, but they're all thinking about, where do I want to go? Do I want to go to startup? Do I want to go to a big company? Do I want to work in government? Do I want to do my own thing? And I like that you touch on that we shouldn't just be hyper-focused on the technology, and that's something that the Tech de Monterrey, we really harp on, that students need to see the ethics, they need to see the citizenship impacts, the communication skills of engineers, as well as entrepreneurial thoughts.
Well, and back to the problem, and the solution question is really be regularly asking you what what problem you're solving, because you'll find the more you apply technology, problems tend to shift and open up. You see things differently the more you learn about a domain. And there are, if you're really, really interested in solving problems, in complex problems, government is a really good place to work, because I was always very entrepreneurial. Like, I can solve any problem. I can do anything with technology. I'm a really smart guy and I can figure anything out. I'm too big. And once you go into government, you realize, oh, yeah, these are some pretty big problems. You know, how do you make sure people have water? How do you make sure people have health care? How do you deal with things like corruption? And how do you, you know, deal with things like surveillance? And, you know, how do you deal with weather? You know, I worked with data out of the National Oceanic Atmospheric Association. NOAA is the agency. I never remember the acronym. And then some NASA data. And that's some big data sets and some really amazing problems. And how do you, you know, help figure out hurricane, you know, stuff that's happening with our environment. And then last week I was at Princeton in New Jersey, and we were working on a hackathon. One of my side projects is called the Human Services Data Specification, and it's how we find human services in our communities and trying to get cities to use the same schema. So how do you find a healthcare clinic? How do you find a food bank? How do you find housing assistance? How do you find an STD clinic? You know, things like that. And so I try to get cities speaking the same schema and using APIs. And one of the projects we did was, it was during Irma, when Irma was the hurricane was landing on Florida, and we were trying to make one common set of shelters, so where you could go to find shelter during the hurricane. And we were pulling data from FEMA, which is the federal agency for disasters. We were pulling data from local organizations and churches. And then there was a bunch of activists creating Google Sheets that were entering data and making calls. But we had, you know, 5 data sets that were very different, had different information. You know, it would have the same information. So like the name of the church where people were going. Some people would say Saint Matthews with ST Matthews. Some would say Saint, spell it out. Some would just say, you know, the church down and the address. So how do you reconcile the data programmatically across thousands of record sets and look for patterns? How to use machine learning? And so there's a lot of really interesting problems in government. I think what gets sold as being a problem when you're learning to program, and I think the rock star aspect of having a startup and being rich tends to distract people. But if you really want to solve problems, government is a good place to go.
Wonderful. Other thoughts, folks? Good conversation. I love it. Yeah, Christian? No? Xiomara? No? Tobias? Candy.
So, can you hear me first?
I'll hold up the microphone and mic.
Going back a little bit, as you said before, are there any more risks besides the organization that are looking at my data? And if I want to keep my data secure in my app, should I be concerned about security with these open source APIs out there? Or the only way to really protect my data is developing my own APIs?
Yeah, a personal API question. There is no 100% way to secure your information. You know, the only way would be to live out in the woods and never use credit cards and never use a cell phone. And that doesn't sound like a lot of fun. But so you have to be yes, you should have your own data where you can. You should have your own APIs. I recommend, I store most of my data in Google Sheets, and then I build API facades, you know, like a front on top of Google's API. So I build my own APIs that just use Google Sheets API, and I build my own. I use GitHub very heavily for my public presence, but there's the concept of it's called Posse, publish on your own site and syndicate elsewhere. So that means, you know, rather than just posting an image directly to Instagram, when you take that image, you first post it into your own domain somewhere on your hosting site, on your location, and then you post it to Instagram. And when you do, you make sure it's a lower quality resolution. It's not a high quality one. And then you share it with Instagram. And you do that with every place, Facebook, with LinkedIn, with any place you're publishing your stuff. And it's not just a matter of security. It's a matter of knowing where your data exists and thinking through where you publish your information. And part of that process is I have a password manager. So I use OnePass to manage my passwords. It's an application that allows me to have a different password for each account. And I go through every 4 months and I change those passwords. And then part of that process is, you know, everywhere you're using, you have an account. You know, I ask why I use this. You know, I make sure my password's secure, and I ask, should I be using this? Do I use this service anymore? If you don't use the service, delete it. Delete your account, which always makes you have to understand, well, sometimes I can't delete my account. Some places won't let you delete your information. And so then you start asking yourself, well, before I start using any account and putting my data into it, make sure you can delete your account. So you sign up for a new service, go in, before you fill out the profile, put anything in there, go in and look for that place that allows you to delete, and make sure you can delete it. Otherwise, you shouldn't put your data into their system. I go look to see if they have an API and any sort of data portability, which allows me to get my data out when I'm done using it. If they don't have an API or data portability, I tend to not use a service. Sometimes, you know, sometimes you have to break these rules because there's value there in using the service and you want it. But if you can't get your data out, you know, really think about and minimize what data you put into it. But for me, it's really important that everything starts in my domain, and I have Kinlane and I have API Evangelist are my two main domains. All my thoughts, all my images go into that, because after a decade of doing this, in an age where Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and everyone wants to make money off of me, I'm able to make, you know, $5,000 to $10,000 US a month off of my blog and my thinking and my work, because I didn't just give that data away. And so I'm able to make a living from my data rather than just getting Instagram and all of these places rich off of my data by thinking about who I give it to, where I put it. So it's not just about security, it's about owning your own stuff and owning your own data. And, you know, thinking about this as it goes forward, the drone stuff is, since last summer, I've been taking a lot of drone video and I've been recording a lot of drone data. So, you know, DJI, which is a Chinese company, I have a Phantom 3 and I have several drones that I fly. It's very interesting that I was thinking about what data I was giving them and where I publish it. The photos and videos that come back, I work in my environment and then I publish places. Eventually, I'm going to start selling some of that. And so being very careful about where I publish my drone videos and my drone photos to is going to allow me someday to make money from that. And it's the same with the data. And as I was learning this, I was studying the U.S. Department of Interior, which is the government agency that manages all of the lands. They were using drones to map national parks, map the interior of the United States. they issued a press release last summer that said, stop flying DJI drones. And I asked around and got some information, and they had realized after a year of doing it that this is a Chinese-owned company, and the U.S. government was basically mapping the United States for the Chinese government. And they realized it, and they said, oh, stop doing it. We need to think about this. And so it's not just you and me that are thinking about this. It's government agencies. And it's partly security, partly protecting your information. But mostly for me, it's about doing that enough so that you can make a living, because that's how Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and all these people are getting rich, is off of your data. And if you want to make a living in this digital age, you have to secure and take control of your own data. Otherwise, someone's going to do it for you.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, all of them are publishing on their own blogs. And so we've been talking about, even though it's not about the course, the discussion about reclaiming your data is pretty big. And, you know, I have a bias on that. So that's definitely been a subject here as well. Other thoughts, guys? My foreign students? Tobias, Serkan, Martin, Jonathan? Thoughts, questions for Ken? Go ahead, Tobias. Let me hold the microphone. It's better.
I'm pretty new to APIs. The first time I really thought about them was here in class. Well, I've blocked them before with NoScript, for example, but didn't really think about it that much. And how would you give me a hint to get into the topic? What would you do to start dealing with APIs?
What are you studying again, Tobias?
I'm studying mechatronics.
Okay. Mechatronics students here. I've got a mix of some foreign students that are not my regular competing students here as well. So how do you get started in this?
Yeah, any software you use already probably has an API. So if you're using a piece of software in your classes, in your studies, for any of your project work, look at the companies that you might look to get a job with someday in your field, and study them. Go to their website and see what software they use in their businesses to operate, and then study those companies and see what they have as APIs. So when I fly around in my travels and I'm on the airplane, and someone always asks, well, what do you do? And I'm like, well, I'm the API evangelist. And they're like, that sounds silly. What is that? And I always start with, you know, trying to explain. I say, well, what do you do for a living? And, you know, if they're in construction, or if they're an architect, you know, I'll say, well, you know, CAD, you know, the CAD drawings, you know, AutoCAD has some amazing APIs for how they work with their 3D models and rendering. And so I always try to base it in what they do. If they don't really have a profession, if they're, you know, just a regular person, you know, I always start with you know, every one of these icons have an API. So if it's your banking, if it's your music app, you know, Spotify, if music's your thing, you know, go to Spotify and learn about Spotify's API, because it's the one, I think, the biggest problem with computer science training, you know, no offense to schools, tried to, you know, the amazing teachers, is trying to make this stuff relatable to the average person. Nobody's going to care. You know, I always say nobody cares about an array until you have something to put in that array that means something to you. So you're never going to care about APIs until they do something that's meaningful to you and important to you. And so always start with what you're passionate about. And I was hanging out in the train station in Washington, D.C. yesterday, and I bought a young man dinner who was asking for money, and talking to him and asked him, you know, trying to find a way that he would connect with technology. And I said, have you ever programmed or done anything? And he said, well, I set up a WordPress site for my friend who's trying to be a hip hop star. And I said, well, WordPress APIs, okay. And so I started talking about, you know, and so always trying to find the way that matters to you. So, you know, and especially after doing APIs for 7 years, they can get really boring. and they can get very technical. You have to be passionate about it. So start with what you're studying. Start with the applications on your phone. Start with the companies that you're gonna, maybe look to get a job with, and see what software they use. And they all have APIs, and that'll, I think, bring it home for you and make it something you'll care about.
I would really like to just play a little bit around with it, like see what I can do, maybe program a little fun API just to play around with. Like, that would be fun.
Well, there's the API Evangelist 101 page as well.
Yeah, I read that.
Well, and you're always welcome to email or tweet at me an interest of yours, and I'm happy to do a story on it and try to find companies who are doing APIs in that area that I'm really good at finding APIs and finding companies who do them. A lot of companies really suck at publicizing their APIs, and so I have to find them. And so it can be hard to find them sometimes. But if you have an idea or something that you're passionate about, I can probably find an API or something for it. And then the other problem is, once you do find that API, most of them are can be very technical. And so I like thinking through how to make it accessible to people who aren't maybe not writing code, and whether that's using Postman. Anybody use Postman in your class? Yeah, so Postman is a really good way of using APIs without having to write any code. So it's at getpostman.com, but it's called a client or a web client, API client. But you can use it. You can find an API, grab the address, and put it in. It'll allow you to authenticate, and then you can make calls to it without ever writing any code. But that's just one example. I have a lot of friends who are not very technical and can't write code, and so it's always interesting to me to find ways to introduce you to that API that you might be passionate about without writing any code. So let me know if I can help.
Yeah, this would be one of your awesome extra posts that you can do for the course as well.
Yeah,
I share it with others.
I can do one.
All right, cool.
I'm coming from an industry background, so I think that sector has a lot of opportunities, and because of industry 4.0, I think I can really find something there.
There's a lot of opportunities if you're in an industry that, every industry is being touched by APIs right now, but some of them haven't spread as much. And if you can be that person who understands your industry and then understands APIs, even if it's not very deep, there's a big opportunity for you to maybe make a career out of it. It's really important that there's API evangelists now. I look at all industries, but each industry needs its own API evangelist now, and people to just tell stories and connect the dots. You don't even have to build anything. I haven't built anything in 5 years, and I can program. I mean, I still do a lot of programming, but all I do is tell stories. So if you're looking to build a career in your space, it's a good chance.
Awesome. Other thoughts? We're getting close on time.
How many
Go ahead.
APIs have you deprecated?
More than I've kept alive. Yeah, that's something you have to ask yourself, is everyone you put out there, you have to kill.
Mhm.
So everything you bring to life, you'll have to kill someday. And if you get people using it and depending on it, that means you're going to break their hearts. And if you do a startup that is building interesting things using APIs, eventually you will get sold to a company. And I have many friends of mine who have broken my heart because they sell their company, their baby that I was using, and I've convinced others to use, and then they get sold and they shut down the company. And it breaks my heart a lot. It's a very sad space. But it's good. You can do good things. Don't let me end on that note, because it's a question you have to ask. You have to think about before you give birth. is you have to think about what the death of your API will look like.
And I think as engineers, they should all be thinking about that. And getting back to your point about data is when you're putting data somewhere, you got to think about how am I going to get it off and end of life of anything. And
Yes,
I know both you and Audrey talked about all the data that we own and what happens when we go away, right? We need to think about what happens to our data when we pass on.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of things we should think about in that aspect as well.
Yeah, if you want to, yeah, I will. If you want to think about longevity of APIs, study what APIs get built at NASA, because they put APIs into things that get sent out into space and won't have a specific end of life, and they have to, and they can't always update them and can't always. So NASA is a great place to think about that. But
Hubble telescope.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much, Kin, for giving us this time today. It's really, really valuable for all my students. And so why don't we give Kin have an awesome day. We'll be in touch. I definitely want to see you come down and work with our students here sometime.
Yeah, I would love to do that sometime. So please, let's keep, I've done, enough virtual. I would love to come in person and meet people. So, and feel free to email me, you guys, or tweet at me with any questions about APIs or careers, or I need this stuff for my stories on my blog. So please.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Ken. I'm going to hit the stop button. Thanks again. We'll be talking soon.
Thank you.